relationships. But my point is to kind of be careful and mindful about how much you share about yourself and with whom you share information, because not everyone in these environments is necessarily going to be on your side. You know, not necessarily everyone has your best interest at heart. And I have seen, you know, too many situations where people kind of got themselves into tricky situations because they were a little too open in those kind of TA grad student spaces, you know.
I was going to answer your question in a slightly different way, and I said this at the Preparing Future Faculty Retreat, and I think when you go into a new work environment, it's really important to know what the expectations are. Like, what do they, who the people who are going to promote you, reappoint you, what is it that they expect from you? And for academia, it's generally research, and they usually will have some sort of designation, explicit definition about what it is that they expect by the time you go for tenure, whether it's a book or maybe a series of articles. There's also teaching, like maybe they want a certain type of range of classes or a certain level of teaching evaluations, and then there's service. So just to be aware of what their expectations are, not to say that you necessarily need to completely live your life according to those rules, but to just be aware that this is what it means to succeed in that environment. And then I also say, in addition to knowing those rules, to say, what is it that you want to get out of the situation, right? Do you want to make sure that a certain field is represented? Do you want to make sure that you're mentoring students who don't get mentored? Do you want to make sure that you can finish this particular research project because it's really important and no one else has done it, right? So there are your goals that you need to be able to match up in some way with the expectations of the institution. And I think the third piece is to make sure you translate when those different, your personal goals and the institutional goals don't mesh up, right? So can you translate all this additional work that most of your colleagues don't do or don't recognize? Can you translate that into a way that people can recognize as something that's valuable in the institution? So it's not necessarily about being yourself, but it's about making sure that the priorities and the value that you have get some recognition and are actually implemented in your work situation.
Right. So I'm going to ask two questions and then just kind of go down the line and you guys can choose which one you answer, and then we'll, as soon as that's done, we'll open up for questions, right? In the future, there's other questions people have. But there's two questions on here I think are really important. One of them is, as a woman of color, do you feel an extra responsibility to mentor students and serve as a role model for other women of color on campus? And like, how difficult or easy is that to manage along with what you're doing as a starting professor? And then the other question I think that's really important is, as a woman of color, do you feel like you have to go above and beyond to sort of establish some sort of authority in the classroom, and like how you manage that? So you guys can pick which question you answer, and maybe we'll just go down the line, and then when we're done, you can just go immediately into questions.
I'll answer the whether I feel the extra responsibility to mentor students and serve as a role model. So this is my first job straight out of grad school, so I was a little green coming into this profession, basically. And it took me a while to realize that, oh yeah, I am serving as a role model now. Now, like, I need to get into that frame of mind. And so now I currently have a grad student who is a woman and she is of color. And I feel the responsibility basically of telling her, giving her information that she's not going to get from other from her classes, simply because other professors cannot relate. And so she did, like, even from our first meeting, she was asking me how my transition to Columbus was, knowing that, well, where you came from, there were more Maine than there are here. And so I've been frank with her simply because I feel that I would be doing a disservice to her if I was just sugarcoating everything. But yeah, now that I have a couple of years under my belt as an assistant professor, I do feel the responsibility to be a role model.
I've really benefited from kind of informal and formal groups with women of color in the academy, and so I really appreciate it when I can foment it in my or create it in my own with the students that are working with me. Now the tough part is that, you know, it's part of juggling one's work life as well with one's private life. I have a young child who's very demanding. Until this fall, I had a long distance relationship for the last 6 years. And so I spent most of my energy just trying to maintain that relationship. And one of the reasons why I was so excited to come to Ohio State was because of, I felt like I needed mentorship too. And so people like Judy and Leslie, who are tenured faculty and, you know, are such amazing mentors to many of you, I know, but are amazing mentors to me as well, because then I see how to navigate the paths of the university, whereas at the University of Montana, it was just me and my other colleague who we came in together, and so we mentored each other as fitfully as we could. And you know, and there was a Native American, the chair of Native American Studies would try to mentor us as well, but you know, we were new faculty with new concerns, and you know, we had to complain about all the evals that we got and the craziness of our colleagues. You know, we had to complain to somebody who would be sympathetic, because most of my colleagues who are a little bit older, and I'm not saying older, but just more advanced, they've already done that completely, right? So I really benefited from it. But again, there's this kind of balance with the work-life situation, and many of you may have a job like I did in terms of my first job, where it will just be you, right, in terms of creating this kind of community. So I guess, you know, it's one of those things is what can you do and stay sane, right? What kinds of community and what kinds of spaces can you create? Is it just enough to maybe have a dissertation writing group that's, you know, of people that you feel comfortable sharing your writing with? Is it at the junior faculty level, is it creating a writing group, or you know, just meeting informally with this friend that I had, as someone said, heterosexual life partner? Well, this, my friend, was that for me, right? Because, you know, we knew that it wouldn't go anywhere. It was very private. So I feel that it is my duty, and it is my responsibility, and I've benefited from it, and I want to do more, especially after tenure. But one has to also realize that there are 24 hours in the day and 7 hours, and in the end, I think I was talking with my colleague Joe Ponce, and he was mentioning that Josephine Lee, a senior colleague at Minnesota, was saying that it takes Asian American faculty, Asian American Studies faculty, 10 years to get tenure, because they all have to move jobs. Because they're not going to get tenure at the institution because they were doing so much of the kind of mentoring that they were hired to do, yes, but that was not being done by other faculty, right? Because the load is going to be very uneven. And it has its benefits and its drawbacks, right? It's personally fulfilling, but it doesn't get you tenure, right? So then you're forced to move, and so junior faculty have to go for 2 jobs, maybe 3, and it's taking them 10 years. Which for some faculty, that means full professor, right? A 10-year career might be right before full professor and 2 books. So they're losing a whole another rung on the ladder and another book in the process. So it's really like what you can live with, right? How much time and energy you have. And in the last year, just with my son, it's really, really sucked. Or rather, it's very rewarding. Sucked time, not sucked as in bad. I'm sorry, I didn't feel that full sentence, but you know, it is exhausting, especially when you're reading and go sleep. But now I sleep. And I sleep like the dead. So if he wakes up, I don't hear him. Yeah.
Maybe I'll answer the question about authority. I definitely have to assert my authority in the classroom. And I came from a graduate program where I had maybe 3 or 4 opportunities to teach. And I was very interested in fostering open dialogue and having a very democratic classroom. And then when I came here, it's like, no, I have to be the authority. And you have to do that, especially in large lecture classes. Like, you cannot show any weaknesses, like, you know, sharks with blood, right? And I think it's different when you get in a graduate class or in a class that's devoted to discussion, but you really have to assert your authority. And I even have to do that among my colleagues. One of my colleagues, I was doing her a favor, reading an honors thesis for her student, and then she criticized my critiques of the honors thesis. statement saying that I'm just very sensitive because of who I am. I was like, no, actually I have an expertise in immigration history, and my critiques are because of my knowledge of the field. Right? So she was reducing it completely to my background, my racial background. Now this is a senior colleague who's going to vote on me tomorrow, by the way, for full professor, and who was on the promotion tender committee, right? So I kind of have to smack her back in place and just say, listen, I have a certain expertise, right? So it's not just your students, but it's also your colleagues. I remember talking to a very senior white male colleague in my department, and I was complaining about how some of the students don't know how to address me. They might call me Mrs. Wu, like I'm their high school teacher, or they just won't say anything. They don't really know how to address me. And he says, oh yeah, you know, I get doctor this and that all the time. I'm like, well, that's not the inclination. And so it's very clear how you have to kind of assume the position in the classroom.
My colleague has a good comeback for that. She was told, you know, Mrs. Bergman instead of Professor Bergman. She's like, that's my mother, or you know, you could say your aunt, or that's my grandmother. That's not me, you know, or something like I'm Professor Bergman.
I'm struggling because I'm trying to figure out which question to answer. I might just
You
try
can
to
leave
answer
both
like
answers
both
if you want.
quickly. No, there's absolutely no question in my mind that we have to go above and beyond to establish our authority. And I think you make a really good point that it's not just in the classroom, but it's just sort of in the university community at large. I actually had a similar situation to Michelle, where this was my first job out of graduate school. I was 28, you know, when I took this job and first started teaching, and so, you know, it becomes kind of multiple things. You're a woman, you're young, you're of color, you know what I mean? It's kind of these multiple identities, and it's very hard, I think, for people to, you know, they kind of have an image in their minds about what they think and who they think a university professor is. You know, it's kind of the guy with the, you know, goatee and his little spectacles and the patches on his, you know, the tweed jacket and the patches, you know, so, but it's a picture that I don't fit at all, you know, and so everybody kind of has to sort of recalibrate. They have to kind of adjust what their vision is, and you know, it really is a challenge, especially at that moment when you're making the transition from being a graduate student to being a faculty member, because you're trying to get the students to take you seriously, but it's kind of like you have to take yourself seriously in a particular way as well. So I mean, I can think of all kinds of examples where I felt like students, you know, challenged me in the classroom. One of the things that I thought of when you were describing your situation is a meeting that I went to of faculty and staff people. And it was the first meeting, and everybody, you know, it was this huge committee, and everybody's going around and introducing themselves, and I introduced myself, and the chair of the committee turns and looks and is like, oh, you're Leslie Alexander, like, you're the, because I was kind of one of the main faculty reps on the committee, and he goes, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize you were a grown-up. Right? And like, you know, I kind of felt like I was teaching that day, so I felt like I'd gone out of my way to dress, you know, I mean, I was scrubby or whatever, like I was really feeling, and then the woman who's sitting next, and I was just totally taken aback, I had no idea what to say. The woman who's sitting next to me turns and she goes, I know it's hard to believe that's actually his idea of a compliment. Like, apparently that was his way of trying to say, oh, you look really young, or, you know, like whatever, he felt like that was a compliment. But to me, that was like, you don't actually take me seriously as someone who can be like a member of the faculty and like representing the faculty on this issue. So yeah, we have to go way above and beyond. And like I said, I think it means we have to think about ourselves differently, and we have to require that other people think about ourselves, think about us differently too. And I think it does sometimes mean we have to dress in a particular way, we have to present ourselves in a particular way that sometimes our white male colleagues don't, in order to kind of overcome that. Just really quickly on the other thing, I mean, yeah, it's the same thing. I don't think there's any question about the fact that as women of color we get asked to, you know, to mentor students, and I think to kind of provide a particular kind of level of like support for students that, you know, again, our white male colleagues in particular just never get faced with the kinds of situations that we get faced with. Students coming in with personal problems, their crises, you know, we get all kinds of stuff that our colleagues don't. And, you know, sometimes, honestly, some days